Okay, we're starting back up right where we left off with the capillaries. And I mentioned the different types of capillaries. Again, you have what's called a continuous capillary. This is the majority of capillaries in our body. It's just referring to the fact that there's almost no spaces in between the walls of the capillary. So it's just like a very, very thin tube made of cells. That would be a continuous capillary. A fenestrated capillary, you can see here, the big difference are these pores that exist. They're little tiny holes. And that's going to be to allow different materials to pass through. In a typical continuous capillary, only very small gases and small molecules can pass through. Obviously, if the capillary has fenestrations, larger things may be able to pass through. In places like your liver, you actually have what's called sinusoids, which are even bigger fenestrations to allow for even larger things to pass through, like hormones and proteins and things. We'll get to that later. So again, those continuous capillaries have a complete endothelial lining. This is found, the majority of our capillaries are these continuous capillaries, and it's mostly just all about fluid exchange and gas exchange, nutrient exchange. Here we're not looking at any proteins moving back and forth, no hormones going back and forth, no blood cells going back and forth. It's just the other stuff that needs to be exchanged between the plasma and interstitial fluid. There are specialized continuous capillaries that are located throughout the body, for instance, in the central nervous system where hormones need to be released, or within the thymus where those T cells and B cells need to be released. They have very restrictive permeability in general, and like the blood-brain barrier would be a continuous capillary. The fenestrated, as I said, have those pores, and this is going to allow for very large molecules to squeeze through things like the hormones, as I mentioned, and the choroid plexus, which is, again, where that exchange of cerebrospinal fluid and blood take place. The endocrine glands allowing for the exchange of hormones, kidneys allowing for, again, hormones and special proteins to get back and forth, as well as the intestinal tract allowing those large food particles and fat droplets to come in. So here you see the overall structure of a capillary. I'm just going to move, got my whiteboard handy just in case. Overall structure of the capillary, again, the continuous, almost no gaps in between the endothelial cells. And then with the fenestrated, you have these little tiny gaps or pores allowing for those large molecules to sneak through. Again, sinusoids or sinusoidal capillaries are a special type of fenestrated capillaries. These are located within the spleen, where red blood cells need to leave the blood and go to their little graveyard and to be recycled. Bone marrow, where blood cells are being made and need to get into the blood. Endocrine glands, where those large hormone proteins need to get in and out, as well as the liver. The liver is putting special osmotic proteins into our blood, all the clotting factors, which are proteins. Lots of large proteins come in and out of the liver. So those are the main parts of the body that have those sinusoidal capillaries, allowing for those large proteins to be exchanged. Water and other plasma proteins are going to go freely in and out of those places as well. So there's special phagocytic cells that live there to make sure no invaders, bacteria, or pathogens are sneaking in to those locations. We call an area where the capillaries diffuse a capillary bed or a capillary plexus. This is basically where one arteriole and one venule meet. Those capillaries branch out and form a capillary bed. At the arterial end of our, let's see if I can draw this out. I should have grabbed colors. Oops. So here's an arteriole coming, and then it's going to branch off into these capillaries, and all these capillaries branch off and kind of move through this way and come back to like a venule, right? So this is the venule side. This is the arterial side. I hope you can see this. I have no way of seeing what I'm actually doing to make sure it looks right too, but this is the capillary bed. There's actually little channels over here. Actually, they're probably more like this. Little gated channels all over this capillary bed, opening and closing at different times. So at any given moment, not all of these capillary beds have blood in them. In fact, some of them may be in fact, all of them may be shut at once and blood's being rerouted somewhere else. For instance, right now I'm in my basement. My hands are kind of cold. The reason my hands are cold is because many of my precapillary sphincters are shut because that blood is being redirected to the important parts like my brain and my heart and my, whatever, my stomach because I just ate, things like that. So those precapillary sphincters are there to shunt the blood off and alternate where that blood goes. And it kind of happens in little pulses. So here you can see a much better drawing of what I just tried to illustrate for you, that arterial end. And you have this kind of branching network, those precapillary sphincters generally on the arterial side, but you can see that they're kind of throughout, just redirecting and rerouting the blood flow throughout the capillary bed. And what you also see is the exchange that takes place. If you look at the blood on the arterial side, it's red, meaning oxygen rich. This is nutrient rich. And then on the venous side, it is oxygen depleted and has more waste products in it. So there's also structures called thoroughfare channels, and you can see that on this structure here. A thoroughfare channel is just a straight away through the capillary bed. So that's where the majority of the blood's going to go, through that thoroughfare channel. And again, it's just a quick bypass through that capillary bed, keeping the blood moving. It's controlled by these little meta-arterioles or smooth muscle segments. There's also collaterals. Collaterals are going to be offshoots of the capillary bed, allowing for circulation just in case one or two of the arterioles is blocked. There's also an anastomosis. An anastomosis would be where two arteries fuse together. So in other words, an arterial leads to another arterial, or an artery leads to another artery, which might sound weird, but there's several of them. There's also arteriovenous anastomoses. This would be a direct connection. In other words, there's no capillary bed at all. The blood goes right from an arteriole to a venule back to a vein. Angiogenesis is the process of making new blood vessels. This uses a growth factor called vascular endothelial growth factor, or VEGF. This happens as you're growing. This happens when tissue is damaged and needs to be regrowth. And it's expressed in times of stress and when there are oxygen-starved cells, that VEGF is going to be released and basically tell your blood cells, well, we need to figure a way around this roadblock and start creating other blood vessels there. So it's very, very important in cardiac muscle because cardiac muscle, of course, is responsible for pumping the blood to our entire body. So if you don't have the blood going to the cardiac muscle, then those cardiac cells are going to die. So VEGF is very important there. There's also something called vasomotion. Vasomotion is that kind of synchronicity that occurs between those precapillary sphincters and the capillary bed. So as the different precapillary sphincters are kind of opening and closing, it creates this kind of pulse through the capillary bed system of that entire part of the body. And that's what's called vasomotion. It's allowing for that blood to constantly change routes. Maybe it goes this way first, and this way next, and then this way, and then this way, and then this way. So it allows for this constant flow and no traffic jams, so to speak, in the area. Then we got veins collecting blood from those capillaries, returning it back to the heart, much larger in diameter, much thinner walls, much lower blood pressure. So, of course, we're starting with venules collecting from the capillaries, and then the medium-sized veins, which have a very thin tunica media, very few smooth muscle cells. They're not contracting or restricting or dilating at all. And then the tunica externa is really just there to hold it in place, hold those veins in place. Large veins have all three layers, intima, media, externa, and they also have what's called venous valves, valves that are one-way valves that shunt the blood, keep it moving in one direction. This is going to prevent the flow of the backflow of blood. If you can imagine standing up, that blood trying to get up to your heart, but gravity wanting to push it back down. Those one-way valves are kind of like little checkpoints. Once the blood gets past them, they can't get back down. Compression of your muscle, of your skeletal muscle, is also going to help squeeze the blood in the veins back up to the heart. So we'll stop this video here. Assuming I can, there we go.